Drax Power Station, the largest power station in the UK built by the CEGB with 6,660 megawatts turbo generators. It lies on a 425-acre site situated on the south bank of the River Ouse and forms part of the Selby Coal Network, which was discovered in 1967. Our research question explores the wider impacts and networks that Drax Power Station had at varying scales. The network map shows the flows of material and social influences. Drax Power Station opened in 1975, with 3 coal-fired units and a total generating capacity of just under 2,000 megawatts. In 1986, Drax Power Station doubled in size, providing 6% of the UK's power. Built in 2 phases and where possible they replicated Phase 1 in its construction. The 10-year gap between phases made this difficult. The first half was built using the imperial system and the second in metric. Metrication meant that many items then being produced were to a different standard, and operating experience had led to design improvements already considered standard by manufacturers. Why Drax? Rail access, the proximity of the Selby coalfield, the River Ouse, and the amount of ash generated in a process requiring a large site are all factors in the position of Drax. There was no planning limit for the height of the buildings in the city. In 1973, oil remained a source of cheap and readily available fuel, and consideration was given to the potential expansion of the Selby coalfield, primarily as a replacement capacity for mines that had been depleted in the west of the coalfield. It was also built to provide for the huge increase in electricity demand in post-war Britain. It was built at a time of high interest rates and unemployment. Many locals saw it as an opportunity that brought jobs to the area and created a legacy of employment. Drax site infrastructure and networks. Drax site has been influenced by the flows in and out of the power station. Cooling water flowing in and out, electricity flowing out, people flows in and out, fuel flowing in, and ash out. Clifford, T and Gale were the builders of Drax. Grouping of cooling towers took into account the failure of Ferry Bridge and the effects of the storm. They did not seem to realize that there was an enhanced wind effect on an incomplete building, which meant the addition of a considerable amount of temporary bracing during construction. The station was constructed at a time when the coal was winding down, but the power was required. Parsons had to install 660 megawatts of turbo generators. There are arguments that Drax was in part a political agency to keep Northeast companies in operation. The ex-employee indicated that the concept was that post-Drax, which could have been marketed to other countries and generated a market. In fact, there was little demand for 660 megawatts turbo generators. Landscape and architectural features. The Skylark Centre and Nature Reserve at Barlow Ash Mound is home to a habitat of more than 100 species of wildlife, holding more than 301 million cubic meters of ash. Weddell. Arnold Weddell began his practice in 1957. He worked for a brief time as a planning officer and started teaching at Liverpool University in 1956 as a lecturer in the Department of Civic Design. His early commissions had been private gardens. He has also collaborated with Professor Miles Wright on urban planning projects in Bootle. The first major landscape architectural commissions started to arrive in the early 1960s at Skelmersdale New Town, Drax Power Station and Heriot-Watt University. The Central Electricity Generating Board gave Weddell a range of tasks in the planning of the site. One was to determine the positions of potential Trent and Ouse power stations. Drax was the biggest one. Shortly after Weddell started working as Granada professor at Sheffield, the CEGB asked him to evaluate 2 more sites. Barlow Ash Mound. Early site planning work for the new Drax power station included the evaluation of a range of possible sites for an untested dry tipping method for pulverized fuel ash. Weddell convinced the CEGB client and specialist geotechnical engineering consultants that planting hedges and small forests on shallow soils with a depth of up to 40 meters of PFA was feasible. This set up a research program that showed that the roots of the tree could not reach the compacted ash and instead grew perfectly healthy, wind-stable trees on less than 300 millimeters topsoil. Within the local coal network, Drax sourced most of their coal from Gascoigne Wood or Kellingley mines. These were connected to Drax by a merry-go-round system developed by Beechings 1963. The surrounding villages have been significantly impacted by the coal freight to Drax, with local MPs complaining in the Houses of Commons. amenity. Former employees and locals speak about camaraderie at the station and jovial competition between stations. There have been many Drax-related social clubs, including angling, cricket, tennis, model rail and social clubs. The ex-employee recalled that the Drax Social Club was only open to Drax employees for a limited time after privatization. This has now been resolved, but ties with the local public should have improved slightly. The CEGB offered apprenticeships in which trainees can transfer between stations. The station still has a strong relationship with education and with Selby College. There are also on-site educational areas in the Skylark Nature Reserve. A former employee remembers that there was no such provision of accommodation as in mining villages. The CEGB did not want to duplicate this. Instead, workers came from the local areas and the CEGB offered some benefits for those wanting to travel closer to the station, such as Camblis Forth, Drax and Snaith. The existing landscape of Drax was predominantly meadow woodland. In 2000, most of the surrounding vegetation fell into the category of neutral grassland. The soil pH in the area has changed due to Drax coal ash. Drax used the waste heat from the station and in 1981 began operating a salad farm containing tomatoes and an eel farm for a short while. It was thought that the idea of having farms around power stations could be introduced to other stations in Europe. However, because of high cost, it is more beneficial to use aquaculture than agriculture. Design. Comparison of other power stations in context. When comparing the station with Eggborough and Ferrybridge, Drax is considerably larger. Consideration had to be taken during its construction when transporting parts for the station. Transport was done at night. In 1989, Drax was investigated by the Environmental Health Officers and the Inspectorate of Pollution because of the muddy drizzle that was showered from the power station in Yorkshire. And in 2018 there are still several high biodiversity value areas being affected by air pollutions that are considered harmful to the ecosystem, especially the Thornmoor and Skibworth common sites. National Coal Networks. As the local coal mines such as Selby closed, Drax began sourcing fuel from Hatfield and Maltby mines as well as around 50% of coal from abroad imported through Immingham. Drax was also significantly impacted by national policies on coal and coal transport. Politics. The CEGB was a publicly owned, nationalised organisation that designed and operated the generation and transmission of electricity. It was charged with achieving the most economic generation possible and delivering power supplies in bulk to the consumer distribution boards. Established in 1958, in 1974 the miners' strike happened, then 138,000 workers in the 1980s. The government's decision to privatise the power supply sector was one of the steps included in the Queen's Address to Parliament in 1987. The industry was no longer the property of the state. Construction, nodes and workforce. Networking. The companies involved in the construction stage with the list of companies from the completion of Drax. The construction of Drax brought companies around the UK to the area. 25% of the working men were made up of travelling men. This also highlights some of the companies by sector as coloured. Advertisements by the companies in the Financial Times advertising through their involvement with Drax. The goal of privatisation included the introduction of competition within the industry and the enhancement of productivity and efficiency. It created a new way of operating and changed the way people travelled between stations and the safety involved. The CEGB has divided its power stations and obligations between the three generators: National Power, Powergen and Nuclear Electric. National Grid was responsible for its transmission. Drax came under National Power. Terrorism was also a threat throughout the 80s, which was also a factor in security at the stations. Since privatisation, Drax has had multiple owners and has faced many financial difficulties. Drax was partially blamed for acid rain over Scandinavia and Scotland and the loss of freshwater fish and damage to forests in other parts of Europe. Drax invested in flue gas desulfurization, which uses limestone to desulfurize and turns it into gypsum, which is used in the building industry for housing. This has had an impact on the infrastructure needed to transport the limestone. Drax is responsible for 35% of the dust deposition in the surrounding areas. When mentioning the acid rain, the Unite publication came from the angle of securing jobs for the workers, by saying the privatization of electricity would lead to a further degradation of the environment. That new technology that can help solve the acid rain situation would not receive the funding it needs to continue research. The successful attempts to resolve the problem of acid rain would also be abandoned. Up to the deadline for stopping all coal-fired fuel by 2025, Drax has turned to biomass, with the final 2 units scheduled to convert the remaining 2 coal-fired units to combined cycle gas turbine units and 200 megawatts of battery storage. Pellets are imported from North America and there are concerns about their sustainability. An environmental charity Client Earth had appealed High Court judgments over Drax gas plant approval. According to their assessment, Drax would produce 75% of the emissions budget for the entire UK power sector by replacing existing 2 coal-fired units with 4 combined cycle gas turbines, CCGT, that have high emissions intensity and longer operating life. In 2016, Drax burned approximately 13 million tonnes of wood pellets worldwide, while the UK's annual production is around 11 million tonnes. The action of repaying the carbon debt does not help to resolve Drax's overwhelming carbon emissions caused by burning massive exotic forest wood and coals. In conclusion, Drax had a major effect on the local, national and international levels, both positive and negative. By continuing to map the networks at different scales, we are in a position to draw insight and inference between the flows and to draw out some of the less visible impacts that Drax has had.